Scott, I'm just going to skip around you and introduce our next guest, Senator Sheila Stevens, who's a Labor colleague of Mr Rudd's, who was first elected to the Senate in 2001. She has been Parliamentary Secretary for Social Inclusion and the Voluntary Sector. Previously a teacher in Sydney and in nearby Goulburn, which you'd all be familiar with. Ursula has also worked and studied in the Northern Territory. She's been a member of the Labor Party since 1975, so has a long history with the party and has held many positions with the party. She has been chair of the Rural Communities Consultative Council, is a member of the New South Wales Rural Assistance Authority and of the New South Wales Board of Vocational Education and Training, and she's deputy chair of the New South Wales Women's Advisory Council. Please welcome Ursula with us this evening. Ursula, can I just ask you for a perspective on the issue of amounts of aid, and it is the constant question for a politician, what are you doing about it, how much are you spending on it? What's your view of the 0.7% of GNI goal that was set in 1970, which many countries have not met? Australia is now coming up to 0.5, which is a bipartisan commitment. Is that enough? Should we be seeing it through that prism of percentages of national income?
Well, thank you. That is an important question, and it's one that we are asked very often. I think that the real challenge for us is not to think about that percentage, but actually to think about the way in which we are escalating and growing our commitment to our international aid budget. And Kevin's leadership in this regard has been quite extraordinary. We are now the OECD country that is most quickly going to get to our commitment of 0.5. So for me, the quantum is challenged by the effectiveness of our aid commitment, where our aid dollars are actually making an impact on the ground, and what it is that we can do to improve that. So this review that Kevin, as the Minister, has announced this week is actually very timely, I think, for us. We haven't had a review, I think, since Minister Downer commissioned something in the 1996, 97, and it's time for us, when we consider how much the global environment has changed, how much the agenda around climate change has changed, food security, our commitment across the range of the Millennium Development Goals, that we really need to see what is it that we can do better, how can we actually make our aid effort on the ground be far more effective and far more strategic, and how can we do things like leverage the incredible philanthropic commitment of people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett to assist us in meeting those Millennium Goal targets. So it's not about that goal, it's about the quantum and the effectiveness.
Thanks, Ursula. Our final guest is Scott Weiser. Dr. Scott Weiser is a research fellow at the Centre for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics at the Australian National University. He has a PhD in philosophy and graduate certificates in women and gender studies from the United States. He currently serves on an Australian Research Council funded project entitled Assessing Development, Designing Better Indices of Poverty and Gender Equality, or Gender Equity, very relevant for our discussion tonight. His current research interests include global justice, global poverty, development ethics and feminist philosophy. Scott has also been a senior field organiser for the Sudan Divestment Task Force and the international coordinator for the Genocide Intervention Network. Please welcome Scott Weiser. Scott, I guess it's the big overarching philosophical question for you. Are we heading in the right direction by setting the Millennium Development Goals with benchmarks, by counting things, the quantum? Are we thinking enough about the breadth of issues? Are we focused too much on numbers?
Yes, we are. I want to break the question down into sort of sub-questions. So the title for the panel is, Are we fixing global poverty? And we should first ask, well, who's we? This idea of a sort of general international community committed to global goals is important for fostering a sense of solidarity and commitment, but it risks obscuring that there are distinct political actors with specific responsibilities to meet those goals, and some of them are failing. Especially rich countries have failed to meet many of their commitments regarding meeting the Millennium Development Goals. The second question is the standards that we should use in assessing progress. So The goals were originally designed globally, but they've since been used to apply at the national level. And the implication has been to make at least some poor countries, which are making very rapid progress, look like they've been failing. And that arguably undermines political and financial support for governments which are doing the right kinds of things. The third thing that we should distinguish is the specific measures that we should use to assess progress in eradicating poverty. The first and most discussed goal of the Millennium Development Goals is to have the percentage of poor people living in developing countries living on less than $1.25 per day in US $2005. This particular method is highly flawed because it relies, among other things, on a method of assessing purchasing power that is not relevant to the lives lived by poor people. We've also failed to measure gender disparity in a number of the goals, including income, poverty, and hunger, and this masks gender distribution of deprivation, as well as drawing political support away from the very important differences in achievements between men and women. Very importantly, the Millennium Development Goals didn't capture arguably the most widespread human rights abuse today, which is freedom from violence, and one that disproportionately impacts women. So moving forward, we should be very careful to design goals that are both reflective of the priorities that poor men and women have and useful for assessing progress at a variety of levels. The commitment of some governments, including Australia, to increase aid budgets is important. But we can't separate, and this is why the review is very important, questions about how much assistance from how we do assistance. We should also be very careful to not excessively focus on measuring impact, ensuring value for money, because there's some amount of work that can be done to justify to taxpayers the important work that their aid dollars are doing. But if we over-focus on that, we might undermine the long-term prospects of having aid being effective for poor men and women. We must also take the conversation away from just aid. So there are a number of policies that rich country governments implement that have significant impacts on the prospects of the lives of poor men and women. Include trade, finance and investment, corporate accountability, anti-corruption and bribery, labor mobility, peacekeeping, the proliferation of small arms, diplomacy, environmental sustainability, and so on. If we only talk about aid in public discussions about eradicating global poverty, we let these other very important and arguably more important rich country policies off the hook. The three biggest threats to future development progress are arguably climate change, conflict, and gender inequity. And as we progress tonight, hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about each of those challenges and what role people in this room and others can play in addressing them.
Thanks, Scott. So if we have some questions from the floor, let's start from over the far side here. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. My name is Megan Cooper, and I'm with UNIFEM Australia. My question is directed to Minister Rudd. I'm wondering about the new gender entity, UN Women. Australia was the first major contribution, is now the second biggest contributor to UN Women. So I guess it's kind of two parts. You identified two gender aspects, particularly in the MDGs, that are where we're failing. I'm wondering if you could just comment on where you see UN Women could help contribute to advancing progress on those MDGs, and as well what Australia's future involvement will be with this new entity. Thank you.
Am I wired for sound?
Yes, you are.
When I was in New York just recently, I spent some time with Michelle Bachelet, who's a good friend of Australia, a good friend of mine, and I think has been an excellent appointment to this position. She brings to it the vast experience of having been president of Chile and an enormous practical frame of mind in terms of how you make things happen. The second point is she faces right now a very substantial organisational challenge of bringing together 4 pre-existing UN agencies which had either complete or partial responsibility for women and development, writ most broadly. Michelle's efforts at the moment are focused very much in completing that internal transformation within the single agency UN Women. Furthermore, in answer to your question, why are we such big supporters of this agency? Because I believe that the overall development challenges faced by women in the developing world, and some of which have been listed by various speakers in the last 10 minutes or so, will be given best effect if we have a single, strong, global voice for women. And I think, as I said before, there is no better person to exercise that role than Michelle Bachelet, given what she's been through in life. And secondly, that can only be done if you bring together the relevant agencies with the UN to do so. Final part of the answer to your question in terms of what therefore, or how will their mandate unfold in the future. She has, I think, a creative year ahead of her between now and the next UN General Assembly. I've invited her here to spend time with us working on that agenda. That's why we are so upfront with funding her and the agency to make it as inclusive and as defined as possible. Violence against women, which has been mentioned already, in my own view, must be up there in lights near the top of the agenda, and how we are able to give effect to a global development agenda which reduces violence against women in developing countries is critical by all manner of policy interventions, including domestic legal frameworks within developing countries.
Perhaps, can I just ask Diana to comment on that, what your view is of the role of UN?
Well, I will agree with Minister Rudd on the importance of having one entity dealing with women issues, and the role that Michelle Bachelet is going to play. We are sure about that, and there is all confidence and all enthusiasm to support her work. One of the recommendations that we made back in 2002, when the roadmap for the MDGs had been completed, is to have a disaggregation of all the MDG indicators by gender, which means not only the specific goal on gender issues should report on progress made by men and women, but every single indicator that is part of the MDG framework should be disaggregated to report on the condition of women and men, but also indigenous peoples and vulnerable groups within countries. This is a recommendation we did in 2002. It had great data challenges because a lot of the surveys and the data sources in the countries do not have that level of disaggregation, but one of the great progresses of the MDG agenda is that we do have nowadays the information that we need to have a proper monitoring of all these indicators by gender, disaggregated by gender. So this is one of the great contributions, we think, of the MDG agenda in the last few years.